Wyoming Territory. Winter, 1882. The cave entrance exploded inward snow, ice, darkness, all at once, and then there was silence. Eva pressed both hands flat against the packed snow wall, solid as granite, 4 feet thick, maybe more. Behind her, Gideon's voice cut through the black. "Hold on to me, Eva. As long as I breathe, this mountain won't swallow you." She turned. He was right there, ash still on his jaw, blue eyes steady in the dying firelight, one injured brother against the wall, an avalanche between them and the world, and a land baron's hired guns waiting below. She had the maps. She had the evidence. She had exactly one way out. She pressed her hands back against the snow and said quietly, "All right, let me think. A cartographer who refused to be owned. 4 mountain men who refused to lose. And a Wyoming winter that was about to test all 5 of them down to the bone. This is their story, and it starts right now." The whistle screamed first. Then came the smoke, thick coal-black, swallowing the last pale light of the Nebraska plains before the darkness took everything else. The locomotive shuddered beneath Eva Sterling's boots like a living thing. Iron wheels grinding against frozen rail, carrying her west at 60 miles an hour and not nearly fast enough. She pressed her shoulder against the cold window glass and watched the snow blur past. Out there, nothing. Just white emptiness stretching to the edge of the world. In here, the hiss of the steam pipes, the creak of wooden car walls, the low murmur of a cattle broker, 3 seats back, talking to nobody in particular about beef prices in Denver. Eva didn't care about beef prices. She pulled the map tube tighter against her ribs. It was worn leather, cracked at the seam near the cap, and she'd reinforced that seam herself with a strip of rawhide cut from an old boot. Inside were 11 months of her life, cadastral drafts, land survey overlays, boundary measurements she'd recorded on foot, in rain, in August heat, crouching over iron pins driven into Maryland soil, while her uncle stood 10 yards back, pretending she was just copying his work. She hadn't been copying his work. She'd been doing it, all of it. Every measurement, every angular calculation, every careful inkstroke on the plat sheets. Chester Sterling had a surveyor's license and a surveyor's reputation, and not 1/4 of her talent with geometry. He'd figured that out 3 years ago, the moment she'd corrected his triangulation error on the Hargrove parcel and saved the firm from a lawsuit. After that, he stopped seeing her as a niece. He started seeing her as an asset. Assets don't get to have opinions. They don't get to refuse. The train lurched around a long curve, and Eva braced her boot against the seat frame. Outside, the moon broke through for a moment, illuminating a flat expanse of frozen river below a ridge of bare cottonwoods. She watched it go by. Then the clouds swallowed the moon again, and there was only her own reflection in the window. Dark eyes, pale face, the collar of her wool coat buttoned all the way up. She looked like a woman running away. She was. 3 weeks ago, Chester had called her into his office and laid out the arrangement with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A man named Duval, a merchant from Philadelphia, 53 years old, twice widowed. Chester had framed it as an opportunity, as security, as the sensible conclusion to a young woman's foolish notion that she might make a career of technical drafting. What he hadn't said, and what Eva had understood completely, was that Duval had agreed to pay a handsome sum for her, and that the cadastral maps would transfer with her, bundled into the marriage agreement like livestock folded into a property deed. She'd smiled back at Chester and said she needed a week to consider. She'd use that week to pack 1 bag, withdraw her small savings from the Baltimore Trust, collect her map tube, and find the advertisement. It had been folded inside a copy of the Omaha Weekly Herald that someone had left on a bench at the train station. She'd almost missed it, tucked between notices for seed suppliers and a testimonial for Dr. Hartley's restorative tonic. But the wording had stopped her cold. Sought 1 female companion, an equal partner for a household of 4 brothers, Cross Ranch, Teton Range, Wyoming Territory. We are not wealthy men, but we are honest ones. We do not seek a housemaid. We seek an equal partner and companion. Requirements, self-respect, and a willingness to endure hard work. Respond in care of the Blackwood Post Office, Wyoming Territory. She'd read it 4 times standing at that bench in the November cold. Equal partner, not housemaid. Equal? She'd written back that same afternoon. The reply came faster than she'd expected. 5 days, which meant Gideon Cross had answered the same day her letter arrived. His handwriting was spare and deliberate, each letter formed with the careful precision of a man who'd learned to write in hard circumstances and never took the act lightly. He hadn't made promises. He hadn't dressed things up. He'd written that Wyoming winters were brutal and the work was real, and a woman with surveying knowledge would be genuinely useful on a ranch that had been fighting a land claim dispute for 2 years. He'd written that his brothers were large men with rough manners who were nonetheless decent. He'd written that she would have her own room with a lock on the door. That last line had made her throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. Not because it was romantic, because it was respectful, because it was the first time in recent memory that a man had thought to say it at all. She'd bought her ticket the next morning. Now the locomotive screamed again, a long, mournful sound that bounced off the ridge and came back as an echo. And Eva shifted in her seat, pulling her coat tighter. The car smelled of coal dust and wet wool and the faint sweetness of tobacco from someone's pipe. 2 rows up, most of the other passengers were asleep, heads tilted against the windows or slumped against traveling companions. The cattle broker had finally stopped talking. Eva wasn't sleeping. She was thinking about Wyoming. She'd studied the maps, of course. She always studied the maps. The Teton Range was a fault block formation, some of the youngest and steepest peaks in the Rockies, thrust upward along a north-south fault line, the western face sheer and dramatic, the eastern slope tapering down toward Jackson's Hole. Snowfall in the high valleys could reach 15 feet by February. The soil along the mountain base was rocky and poorly suited to crops, which meant ranching cattle and horses, with some trapping in the upper elevations. She knew the geography. She didn't know the men. She thought about that. 4 brothers, all under one roof. 4 men who had apparently decided collectively to look for a woman willing to share their life. It was unconventional. That was a mild word for it. Back in Baltimore, it would have been scandalous. The kind of arrangement that got people whispered about at church and uninvited from dinner parties. Out here, Eva suspected, survival had a way of reshaping what was considered sensible. She respected that. She'd spent enough time in the field to know that rigid thinking got people hurt. You adapted to the terrain, or the terrain adapted you. The brothers had clearly figured that out. She pressed her fingertips against the leather of the map tube. 11 months of work. Her work. The calculations were hers. The measurements were hers. The careful lines on the plat sheets were drawn by her hand. Chester would discover them missing by now, if he hadn't already. He'd be furious. He might even try to follow. Let him try. Wyoming was a long way from Baltimore, and she had a 12-hour head start and no intention of slowing down. The snow outside was picking up. She could see it now, even in the darkness, the flakes catching the faint glow of the locomotive's lanterns, spinning sideways in the wind that came howling down off the high plains. The train slowed slightly, compensating for the grade as the terrain began to rise, and the wheels found a new rhythm against the rails. Lower, steadier, almost like a heartbeat. Eva let out a long breath and leaned her head back against the seat. She'd been a cartographer's assistant for 3 years. 3 years of learning that the most important thing about a map wasn't the lines on the paper. It was the decisions those lines made possible. A good survey told you where the firm ground was. It told you where the boundaries were, what you owned and what you didn't, where the water ran and where the drop-offs waited. A good survey was freedom, in a very practical sense. It meant you knew exactly where you stood. She intended to know exactly where she stood. The locomotive whistle shrieked a 3rd time. long and piercing, swallowed almost immediately by the immensity of the winter sky. The sound faded and was replaced by wind and the steady iron rhythm of the wheels. Eva tightened her grip on the map tube. Her mind and her hands would build her own future. She was certain of that now, as certain as a line, drawn true across a plat sheet, as certain as a boundary marker, driven deep into solid ground. Wyoming territory waited somewhere ahead in the dark. She was ready. The stagecoach dropped her at the edge of Blackwood just after noon, and the driver didn't even wait for her to get her bag fully clear of the wheel before he snapped the reins and moved on. The town swallowed the sound of hoofbeats. Quickling here was muffled the snow, the cold, the gray sky pressing down on low timber buildings like a lid. Eva stood on the frozen road and looked around. Blackwood was small and hard-looking, a general store, a livery, a post office with a crooked sign. Two saloons facing each other across the main street, like old enemies who'd gotten tired of fighting, but hadn't moved on. The people she could see moved fast, heads down, collars up. Nobody looked at her. She asked at the post office. The man behind the counter, thin 50s, ink-stained fingers, looked at the name she'd written on a scrap of paper and nodded without much expression. Cross Ranch. Head north on the mountain road. 4 miles, maybe 5. Cabin set back from the tree line, he paused. Big place, hard to miss. She hired a horse from the livery and followed the road north. The mountain revealed itself slowly. The Tetons didn't announce themselves the way she'd imagined. They grew. The tree line thickened on either side of the road, lodgepole pine and spruce, dark and close. And then the ground began to rise. And suddenly the peaks were simply there, massive, jagged, white-capped, filling the northern sky from edge to edge. Eva pulled the horse to a stop without meaning to. She'd seen mountains on maps. She'd drafted their contour lines herself, working from survey notes and elevation data. She knew what they were supposed to look like. The maps had not done this justice, not even close. She gave the horse a nudge and kept riding. The cabin appeared through the trees, as the sky behind the peaks began turning the color of pewter. A structure built for serious winters, thick-hewn timber walls, a deep-pitched roof already bearing 2 feet of snow, a long front porch, and a stone chimney exhaling a steady column of white smoke. Behind the main cabin, a barn twice the size she'd expected, a fence line running north into the trees, a hay sled parked near the barn door, half loaded, and on the porch, 4 men. Eva slowed the horse to a walk. She'd told herself she was prepared. She'd considered, in a practical way, that 4 brothers working a mountain ranch would be large. She'd accounted for that. She was a grown woman who'd spent 3 years doing field work alongside surveyors and laborers, and men who earned their living with their hands. She wasn't easily impressed by size. She revised that opinion over the next 30 seconds. They were enormous. Not in an absurd way, not circus poster enormous, but in the very real, very immediate way of men who had spent years doing work that demanded everything from their bodies. The one in front was the tallest, and she knew without being told that he was Gideon. He stood at the top of the porch steps with his arms crossed and his steel blue eyes steady on her face, and he had the kind of presence that made the porch itself seem slightly smaller. Square-jawed, dark hair, pushed back from his forehead, a week of stubble. His coat was open despite the cold. He looked like a man to whom cold was largely irrelevant. Beside him to the left stood a man with sharper features and a leather-bound ledger tucked under one arm. Leyland, she guessed. He was watching her with open intelligence, taking stock the same way she was. To Gideon's right, a man with warm brown eyes and a physician's careful attention in his gaze Thad, clearly with a medical kit visible just inside the open cabin door behind him. And at the far end of the porch, leaning against the post with his thumbs in his belt, a younger man with wild dark hair and an expression of pure, unguarded curiosity. Jasper. Eva brought the horse to a stop at the base of the steps. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Gideon uncrossed his arms and walked down the steps. He moved deliberately, no wasted motion, each step placed with the certainty of a man who knew exactly where the solid ground was. He reached the horse, looked up at Eva, and held out his hand, Elaine Sterling. Not a question. He already knew. She took his hand and stepped down from the horse, and in the moment their gloves touched. She registered the sheer size of his grip, not crushing, just present, grounding her descent without effort. "Eva," she said. "Everyone calls me Eva." He nodded. Gideon Cross. He gestured toward the porch without releasing her map tube, which he'd taken from her other hand, so smoothly she'd barely noticed. His calloused fingers had brushed against hers. In the exchange, a brief contact, barely a second, but it moved through her, like heat through copper wire, fast and impossible to ignore. She followed him up the steps. Leland introduced himself first, extending a hand with businesslike directness. Thad gave a small, genuine nod. Jasper just grinned at her and said, "You're smaller than I pictured." "You're exactly as large as I pictured," Eva said. Jasper laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, and it broke something loose in the air. Leland's mouth curved. Even Thad smiled. Gideon looked at her with those steady blue eyes and said, almost quietly, "Come inside." The cabin's interior was warm and smelled of pine resin and something cooking venison stew. She'd guessed from the rich smell. It was a working space, plainly furnished but well made. A long table with benches, a stone fireplace that heated the room properly, shelves of provisions along one wall, a second room visible through a doorway, and a lofted sleeping area above it. Everything clean, everything practical. She stood in the center of the main room and turned in a slow circle, taking it in. "Your room is through there," Gideon said, nodding toward the door off the main room. "It's the smallest, but it has a window facing south. Gets morning light." She looked at him. "And the lock?" He met her eyes without hesitation, already fitted. "Key is on the table inside." He paused. "I want to say this plainly, Eva, since we're all here and it's better said once than implied forever. Out here, division means death. We share work and land and life. That's the truth of this place. But you are a free woman. That bedroom locks from the inside. None of us touches you unless you invite us." The room was quiet. The fire popped. Eva looked at each of them in turn, Leland meeting her gaze levelly. Thad with his hands easy at his sides, Jasper watching with that same open attention he'd had on the porch. Then back to Gideon. "All right," she said. "Then I'll tell you plainly, too. I came here to work, and to be useful, and to build something that's mine. I'm a trained cartographer. I know land measurement, boundary law, soil composition, and structural geometry. If there's a land dispute involved in whatever trouble you're dealing with, I can help with that directly." She set her bag down on the bench. "I don't need to be managed, and I don't need to be protected from information. I just need to be treated as an equal." Another pause. Then Leland said, "She read the advertisement." "I wrote the advertisement," Gideon said. "Yes," Leland said, "and you could have mentioned the land dispute was the entire reason we placed it." "You're a lawyer," Gideon said. "You mention it." Leland turned back to Eva. "We have a land dispute. It's complicated. It involves fraudulent deed claims and a man with money and no conscience. And your skill set is frankly exactly what we needed when we placed that advertisement." Eva looked at him. Then, "We'll get on fine." That evening, over stew and bread and strong coffee, they talked for 2 hours. She told them about Baltimore and Chester and the map tube. She didn't leave out the part about Duval, because she figured they'd earned the full truth. None of them reacted with pity, which she appreciated enormously. Jasper muttered something strongly worded about her uncle that made Thad tell him to watch his language and made Eva nearly choke on her coffee. After supper, she took the lamp and unlocked the door to her room. It was small, as promised. A narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a writing table near the south-facing window. The key was on the table. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers for a moment, then set it down and looked out the window at the darkness and the snow and the enormous dark silhouette of the mountains against the sky. She didn't lock the door that night. She didn't need to. But she was glad the option was there. Outside, the wind was picking up. She woke to the sound of Jasper swearing. It was before dawn. The cabin was still dark, the fire burned down to orange coals, and through the south window, she could hear the wind, not the steady background wind of the night before, but something different, something with weight behind it. It came in surges, each one hitting the cabin walls hard enough to rattle the window glass in its frame. Eva was dressed and out of her room in 3 minutes. The main room was lit by a single lantern, and all 4 brothers were already up. Gideon was pulling on his heavy coat. Thad had his kit open on the table, for reasons that weren't immediately clear. Leland was looking at something written on a scrap of paper inventory, she guessed. And Jasper, near the door with his hat already on, was doing something with a length of rope and looking aggrieved about it. "What's happening?" Eva said. Gideon looked up. Blizzard came in faster than expected. "It'll be a bad one." He paused. "The barn roof has a weak section on the north end. Ice gets heavy enough. The pulley beam goes first, then the whole rafter assembly over the stock pens. How many animals? 11 cattle, 4 horses, 2 milk cows, and the breeding sow." Leland put the inventory paper down. "We lose the herd. We lose the winter." Eva looked at the door, where the wind was audibly pressing against the frame. "Show me the barn layout." Jasper looked at her. "You want to go out in that?" "I want to understand what we're working with before I go out in that," she said. "Is there a floor plan? A sketch of the structure?" Leland opened a drawer and produced a rough diagram, hand-drawn, functional. He spread it on the table. Eva leaned over it. The barn was a post and beam structure, which she'd expected. The north end rafter assembly ran across a main carrying beam, which was itself suspended on a pulley and post system, originally designed to allow hay lift access to the loft. The problem was immediately obvious. "The pulley system is load-bearing," she said. "It's sharing load with the main beam." "Yes," Leland said. "That's your problem. If the pulley post goes either from ice load on the roof or from the wind getting under the eave, the beam loses lateral support, and the whole north section folds inward." She straightened, "But you can compensate for it. You put a counter-lever support under the carrying beam, braced against the east and west posts at 45 degrees. It transfers the load off the pulley entirely and distributes it down the vertical structure." She looked at Jasper. "Do you have timber long enough?" "Straight-grained, ideally. 6 by 6 minimum." Jasper stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, in the woodshed. Then let's go." The storm outside was serious. Eva had worked in weather before, but this was a different order of magnitude. The wind came in blasts that stole your breath and filled the space between your scarf and your collar with driven snow in about 4 seconds flat. Gideon went first, breaking the path. She followed with her hand on his coat. The barn was warmer than outside, which wasn't saying much, but the animals were still calm, a good sign. The cattle shifted in their pens, and the horses watched with dark, intelligent eyes as the 5 of them came through the door in a blast of cold air. Eva walked the north end first. She could see it immediately. The ice buildup on the roof was creating a load that ran straight down onto the carrying beam, and the beam was already showing flex, a slight sag in the center, maybe an inch, but that was enough. The pulley post beside it was taking stress it wasn't built for. In a serious gust, the assembly would fail. She pulled off one glove, touched the beam's underside, felt the compression in the wood. Then she put her glove back on and turned around. "Jasper," she said, "I need 2 timbers, 8 feet each, and your heaviest mallet. Leland, there should be iron spike sets in any working barn, long ones, 8 inches at least. Gideon, I need you on the carrying beam with me when we seat the braces." "Thad, I'll be ready," Thad said, which answered the question she hadn't quite asked. It took 40 minutes, working in the barn's bitter cold, with the roof groaning overhead, and the wind hammering the walls in irregular bursts. Eva directed the operation with her arms and her voice, and a calm that surprised even herself. She'd never actually supervised a structural repair. She'd calculated them, drawn them, explained the geometry to engineers, who then executed the work. Now she was doing both simultaneously, and there was no room for uncertainty, so she didn't allow any. She talked Gideon through the precise seating angle. For the first brace, 43 degrees, she'd calculated it in her head against the beam dimensions Jasper had given her. She had Jasper drive the base spike with 3 blows of the mallet, each one shaking the floor, and she held the timber plumb by hand while Leland set the upper bracket. When the brace seated and locked, the flex in the carrying beam visibly reduced. There, she said. Do you feel that? Gideon had his hand flat against the beam. He looked at her. It's solid. The load shifted. Now the second one. The second brace went faster. By the time they had it seated, the roof overhead had stopped its low, ominous creaking, and the main beam was carrying true across its full length. The pulley post was no longer under lateral stress. The north rafter assembly wasn't going anywhere. Eva stepped back and looked at the whole system for a long moment, checking her geometry visually, looking for anything she'd missed. She hadn't missed anything. The adrenaline of the last hour began to ebb, and that was when she noticed her hands. She'd pulled off her gloves twice during the work, once to feel the beam compression, once to set the brace angle by touch. The cold had gotten into her knuckles during those minutes and stayed there. Her fingers were stiff, the joints aching with that deep, particular cold that didn't respond to just putting gloves back on. She was flexing them carefully when Thad appeared at her side. He didn't ask. He just gently took both her hands in his, turned them palm up, and looked at the fingers with the focused attention of someone who was actually assessing, not just expressing concern. Mild frostbite to the first knuckles, he said. You'll keep the fingers, but we need to warm them properly. He sat her down on a hay bale and produced a small tin from his kit, a warm oil, she discovered, as he opened it and began working it carefully into her stiff joints. His hands were steady and deliberate. He didn't rush it. He worked each finger individually, the warmth of the oil and the movement of his hands gradually coaxing the deep cold out of her knuckles, degree by degree. Nobody else spoke for a while. Jasper came and sat on the hay bale across from her, close enough that his shoulder pressed solidly against hers. He didn't say anything either. He just stayed there, that solid point of contact, steady as the post he'd just spiked into the barn floor. Outside, the blizzard hit its full force. The barn walls shook. Snow hissed through every gap in the siding. But inside, the structure held the 2 counter-lever braces, carrying their load cleanly, the animals calm in their pens, the air thick with the warm smell of hay and livestock. Gideon came to stand in front of her. He looked at her for a moment, then at the bracing system she'd designed, then back at her. I should say something. He started. You don't have to, Eva said. I want to, he said. That was what you just did. He stopped. Started again. We've been fighting this land dispute for 2 years, and we've almost lost this ranch twice. And in both cases, what we lacked wasn't strength or willingness. It was precision, knowing exactly where to put the effort. He paused. You had that. Thad looked up from her hands. Your surveying skill and composure just saved years of our hard labor. She looked at him, then at Gideon, then at Leland, who was standing quietly near the barn door, watching the whole scene with an expression she couldn't quite read, but suspected had something to do with profound relief. I didn't do it alone, she said. No, Gideon said, but you led it. That matters. Storm lasted 2 more days. They were confined to the cabin and the barn, moving between the two in the heavy wind, keeping the animals fed, keeping the fires stoked, running through the firewood faster than they'd planned. Eva spent the time at the main table with Leland's ledger books and her own map tube, beginning to understand the scope of the land dispute. It was worse than she'd initially thought. The claim against the Cross homestead was built on a fraudulent mortgage document. She could see that just from the descriptions, the language was off. The boundary references didn't align with standard federal survey markers of the period. Somebody with legal knowledge had constructed it carefully enough to fool a district judge, but not carefully enough to fool a cartographer who'd spent 3 years reading cadastral descriptions. She said nothing about this yet. She wanted the full picture first. On the second evening, with the storm beginning to loosen its grip and the wind dropping from a howl to a steady push, the five of them ate supper together in the amber lamplight. Jasper told a story about a bear encounter that was probably 60% true. Leland argued it was 40%. Thad told Jasper to stop embellishing. Eva laughed, which surprised her. She hadn't laughed like that in a while. Later, when the others had gone to sleep, she sat by the dying fire and looked at her hands. The knuckles were less stiff. Thad's oil treatment had worked. She flexed each finger in turn, watching the firelight move across her skin, and thought about the day. She'd come here not knowing what to expect. She'd been prepared for a transaction, labor exchanged for shelter, usefulness exchanged for safety, a practical arrangement between practical people. What she hadn't expected was this. The way Gideon had looked at her after the barn repair, not with gratitude exactly, but with a kind of recognition. The solid warmth of Jasper's shoulder against hers, the careful steadiness of Thad's hands on her fingers. Leland's quiet, intelligent attention. She hadn't expected to feel, on day 2, like she might actually belong somewhere. That was a dangerous thought, and she knew it. She put it away carefully, filed it under examine later, and went to bed. Outside, the storm was finally passing. The wind had dropped to nothing. Through the south window, for the first time in 2 days, she could see stars. The Tetons stood white and enormous against the dark sky, utterly indifferent to blizzards and disputes, and the small human dramas playing out at their feet. Eva looked at them for a long time before she slept. 3 weeks into January, the temperature climbed just enough to make the road to Blackwood passable, and Leland decided it was time to go. He needed to cross-reference the Cross Homestead's original survey markers against the county deed records held at the Blackwood Land Office. Eva needed the same records she'd been working from the descriptions in Leland's ledger, but the original filed plats would tell her things the ledger couldn't. Specifically, she wanted to see what survey datum the county had used when they recorded the homestead boundaries, because the fraudulent mortgage document used different datum language, and she wanted to prove it on paper before she said another word about it to anyone. Gideon didn't want them going alone. Hayes has men in that town, he said at breakfast. Paid men. They watch who comes and goes from the land office. Then they'll watch us come and go from the land office, Leland said. We're not doing anything illegal. We're looking at public records. He can't stop that. Gideon looked at Eva. She looked back at him steadily. I need those filed plats. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, stay together. Don't split up for any reason. And if Hayes himself shows up, then Leland handles it, Eva said. He's the one with the legal training. Gideon nodded slowly. That's exactly what worries me. Leland put on his coat. They took the wagon. The road to Blackwood was 4 miles of frozen ruts through the pine corridor, opening eventually onto the flat basin where the town sat. Sky was low and white, the air still enough that the horse's breath came out in long, visible plumes with each stride. Eva sat on the wagon bench beside Leland and watched the tree line pass. Tell me about Hayes, she said. Leland was quiet for a moment, organizing his answer the way he organized everything in order of importance. Bartholomew Hayes came to this territory 6 years ago with coal money from Pennsylvania, bought the mineral rights to the Blackwood Formation, which is a legitimate coal seam running under about 12 square miles east of town, built the mine, the processing facility, the company housing. Now he controls the employment of roughly half the men in this county. He paused. When you control a man's wages, you control his vote, his loyalty, and eventually his silence. And the land seizures? He wants the mountain corridor, Leland said. The Cross Homestead sits directly across the only viable northern access route to the Upper Teton Range. There are timber resources up there, and Hayes believes there's a secondary coal seam. If he controls our land, he controls that access. He flicked the reins. So he manufactured a mortgage claim. A document that says our father borrowed money from a Hayes-affiliated lending concern in 1878, secured against the homestead title. Our father never borrowed a cent from anyone in his life, but the document looks credible enough to have gotten a district judge to issue a temporary injunction against our title. Eva had already suspected most of this. Hearing it stated plainly made her jaw tighten. The datum discrepancy in the boundary language will break the document, she said. The fraudulent mortgage describes the parcel using an 1875 GLO survey datum. But the Homestead Act filing for your property, I found the reference number in your ledger that was recorded in 1871 under the original township survey. The boundary language would be different in very specific ways. If I can confirm that against the filed plat, I can show that whoever wrote the mortgage document was working from a different map than the actual title, a map that didn't exist when the supposed loan was made. Leland turned to look at her. That's precise, he said. That's the point, she said. Blackwood appeared through the last of the pines. It looked the same as it had on her arrival, gray and flat and self-contained, the buildings hunched against the cold. But she noticed things this time that she'd missed before. The company housing on the eastern edge, row on row of identical timber structures. The Hayes coal office on the main street, bigger and better built than anything around it, with fresh paint on the sign. The men on the boardwalk who watched the wagon come in with the particular attention of people who'd been told to watch. They went directly to the land office. The clerk was a young man, nervous with ink on his collar, and the careful neutrality of someone who worked for a county that was effectively owned by one man. He produced the filed plats without refusing. He couldn't refuse. They were public records, but he did it slowly, and Eva noticed him glance toward the window twice while she was opening the first document. She didn't rush. She spread the plat on the counter, anchored the corners with her elbows, and read. The original township survey was exactly what she'd expected. Ranges, townships, sections, all referenced to the baseline and meridian established by the 1871 GLO survey of the Wyoming Territory. The boundary descriptions for the Cross homestead used that datum consistently, language she recognized, language she'd used herself in Maryland cadastral work. She pulled the copy she'd made of the mortgage document's boundary language from her coat pocket and laid it beside the plat. There it was. The mortgage used 1875 correction survey language, a different datum. Different enough that the parcel described in the mortgage document was technically a different parcel overlapping, similar, but not legally identical to the homestead title. It was a subtle discrepancy, the kind that would sail past a judge who wasn't a surveyor. It wouldn't sail past Eva. She was carefully making notations in her field book when the land office door opened. The cold that came in with Bartholomew Hayes was only partly from the weather. He was a big man, but not in the way the Cross brothers were big. Hayes was built for a different purpose, wide through the shoulders, heavy in the neck, the body of a man who'd spent years making himself physically imposing, specifically to intimidate. He wore a good coat, expensive boots, and the settled expression of someone who considered every room he walked into to already belong to him. Two men came in behind him and arranged themselves near the door without being told. They wore guns low on their hips and said nothing. Hayes looked at Leland first, then at Eva, then back at Leland. Cross, he said. It came out flat. Hayes, Leland said with exactly the same inflection. Hayes moved to the counter, positioning himself beside the plat spread out in front of Eva. He looked down at it, then at her notations, then at her face. Who's this? A colleague, Leland said. A colleague. Hayes smiled with his mouth. The Cross boys brought a woman out from somewhere to look at maps. The Cross family, Leland said, has a colleague with surveying expertise examining public land records, which is our legal right. as you know. Hayes turned back to Leland. The smile was gone. Let me tell you what I know, Cross. I know that a court injunction is sitting on your title right now. I know the February hearing date is 6 weeks out. And I know you don't have the legal resources to mount a credible defense, because credible defense costs money, and the Cross Ranch, for all its high-minded independence, is operating on a grain budget. We're managing, Leland said. You're behind, Hayes said. I had a man check your winter supply numbers. You're burning through stores faster than you projected, and that storm last week didn't help. He paused, letting the implied surveillance settle in. I'm offering you a fair price for the parcel. Market rate, Cross. You take it. You walk away clear. You find yourself a smaller piece of ground somewhere south of here, and you live your lives. And the injunction goes away, Hayes said. Clean title transfer, no court involvement. Leland was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Hayes looked satisfied, long enough that the two men near the door shifted their weight. Then Leland straightened. He was a tall man. He'd never struck Eva as physically imposing. He was the ledger-in-law one, the strategist, the thinker. But in that moment, he had a quality that was harder to define than size. He stood in the center of that land office, like something rooted, like he'd calculated every angle of the room and concluded he owned every square inch of it. Let me tell you what I know, he said. A family's strength isn't measured by a rich man's power over the weak. It's built on consent and loyalty. His voice was level, unhurried. You have money, Hayes. You have hired men and a compliant judge and a fraudulent piece of paper you'd like us to accept as legitimate. He paused. But you only own slaves. You will never have a family. The room was very quiet. Hayes's expression didn't change on the surface, but something behind his eyes shifted a cold recalibration, the look of a man who'd expected a negotiation and gotten something else. That's a brave speech, Hayes said, for a man standing 6 feet from two armed deputies. And then it happened fast. Hayes made a small gesture, barely a hand movement, and the two men at the door stepped forward, not reaching for guns. Just moving, filling space. The land office clerk made a soft, unhappy sound and stepped back against the wall. Leland moved at the same time. He stepped back and to the side in one smooth motion and pulled Eva flush against his chest, one arm across her, turning, so his body was between her and the two approaching men. His heart was going fast. She could feel it against her back. A rapid, hard rhythm, but his arm was absolutely steady and his feet didn't move. She's a civilian, he said. You want to discuss this further? We discuss it outside. Without her. Hayes looked at them for a moment. Then he made another small gesture, and the two men stopped. 6 weeks, Hayes said. February hearing. You lose. You lose everything. He looked at Eva once more, a long, assessing look that she met directly without blinking, and then he turned and walked out. His men followed. The door closed. The clerk exhaled. Leland released Eva and stepped back. He was breathing carefully, the way people do when they're bringing their heart rate down by deliberate means. He looked at her. Yes, she said. She meant it. She was shaken, but she was all right. And more important, she still had her field book. She looked down at her notations. I got what I came for. So did he, Leland said. He knows we're building a defense. He'll move faster now. Eva closed her field book and buttoned it inside her coat. Then so will we, she said. They didn't speak much on the ride back. The cold had deepened as the afternoon wore on, and the pine corridor was dark and close around the wagon, the light already going gray by 3 in the afternoon. Eva sat with her hands in her lap and thought about Hayes's eyes when Leland had finished speaking. He'd been angry. But underneath the anger, she'd seen something else. He'd been calculating. A man like that didn't accept setbacks. He absorbed them and adjusted. He was going to come back at them, and he was going to do it before the February hearing, and it wasn't going to look like a negotiation. She said as much to Leland as they came through the last stretch of trees before the ranch. He nodded slowly. I know, he said. Gideon knows too. He paused. The question is what form it takes. They found out on New Year's Eve. New Year's Eve came in brutal. The temperature dropped through the afternoon and kept going 20 below by sundown. The air so cold, it had a quality beyond cold. Something that moved past sensation into something closer to danger. The sky was clear and black and full of hard stars, and the snow on the ground had frozen to a crust that cracked like glass underfoot. Eva stood on the porch for 2 minutes after supper, looking at the sky, and then went back inside, because 2 minutes was genuinely enough. Gideon had been watching the tree line since noon. Eva noticed it at lunch, the way his attention kept going to the north windows, and again at supper. When he sat with his back to the wall, facing the door, he hadn't said anything specific. He didn't need to. 3 weeks at the ranch had taught her to read the atmosphere here the way she read terrain, by the details, by what was present and what was absent. What was absent tonight was ease. All 4 of them were carrying a tension they weren't performing for her benefit. She loaded her own map work into the leather tube after supper and put it in the interior pocket of her coat, which she kept on the hook beside her room door rather than the main coat rack. She did this without announcing it. Leland saw her do it and said nothing, which told her everything about how seriously he was taking the night. At 10 o'clock, Jasper came in from the last barn check and said, "There are boot tracks on the north fence line. 3 sets, maybe 4. Not ours." Gideon was on his feet before Jasper finished the sentence. What followed was organized and quiet. Gideon distributed the rifles from the locked cabinet, 1 each, with cartridges, and gave instructions, in a voice pitched low and steady. Eva got the rifle she'd told him a week ago. She knew how to shoot, which had been true when she said it. Thad positioned himself near the medical kit he'd moved to the main room 2 days ago, which told her he'd been expecting this longer than she had. "Stay back from the windows," Gideon said to her. "I know," she said. The first fire came from the barn. She smelled it before anyone shouted smoke, but wrong smoke, the kind that had accelerant behind it. Then Jasper was at the window saying something short and profane, and then Gideon was out the door, and the night became loud and chaotic and very, very fast. The gunfire started from the tree line, not aimed at people. Initially warning shots, she thought, or suppression fire, meant to keep them away from the barn while it burned. She counted 3 distinct positions in the trees from the muzzle flashes, at least 2 guns per position. Hayes had sent serious men. Gideon and Jasper went for the barn. Eva moved to the north window and watched the tree line, calling the flash positions to Leland, who was returning fire from the east window in measured, deliberate shots. He wasn't shooting to hit at this range in the dark. He was shooting to make them cautious. Thad pulled 2 of the horses out the barn side door. She could see him through the smoke, moving fast, calm, talking to the animals the whole time. The cattle were bellowing. The barn's north section was fully alight now, the dry timber catching fast despite the frozen air, and the heat of it pushed out in waves she could feel even through the cabin wall. Then she heard Leland make a sound. She turned. He was still at the window, still standing, but his left hand had come up to his shoulder, and his jaw was set in a particular way. "I'm fine," he said immediately, before she could speak. "Graze. It went through, let me see." "Later," he said, and fired again. She wanted to argue. She didn't. She went back to the window. The barn roof collapsed on the north end 20 minutes in the same north end rafter assembly she'd braced 2 weeks ago, holding until the fire got under it. The cattle were out. By then, Gideon and Jasper, having driven them through the south doors into the frozen corral. The horses were tied to the fence. Nobody was hurt worse than Leland's shoulder. But the cabin's west wall was starting to smolder where flying sparks had found the log chinking. Gideon appeared at the door. He was singed across one arm and breathing hard and covered in ash. He took one look at Leland's shoulder, then at the west wall, and made the call Eva could see him making before he spoke it. "We go up," he said. Leland looked at him. "The cave system? It's the only defensible position they can't reach without crossing open ground. We take what we need, and we move now while they're regrouping." He looked at Eva. "The map tube." "Already on me," she said. "Then we go." They went. Thad had a supply pack ready. She realized he'd assembled it sometime in the last 2 days without making a production of it. Medical kit, food, fire materials, blankets. Each of the brothers carried a rifle. Eva carried the maps and her field book, and the small compass she kept in her coat pocket, as a matter of professional habit. They moved north on foot, away from the burning barn and the muzzle flashes in the tree line, into the black pine forest, climbing. Gideon broke trail. Jasper was last, watching behind them. Leland climbed steadily, and without complaint, and bled steadily and silently into the padding. Thad had pressed against his shoulder before they left. The trail went up for 40 minutes. Eva's legs burned. The cold at this elevation and this hour was something past description. It had intent behind it, or seemed to. Each breath came out in a burst of vapor that froze before it dispersed. She watched her footing on the icy trail and concentrated on the rhythm of climbing and breathed through her scarf and kept moving. The cave entrance was in a granite outcrop near the timberline, a low opening wide enough for a large man to pass through sideways, which was exactly how Gideon went through it first. The interior was larger than the entrance suggested. High-ceilinged, irregular, extending back into the mountain in a passage that bent to the left, maybe 30 feet in. It was cold inside, still. The wind stopped the moment they were through the entrance. Thad got a small fire going with practice speed. By the firelight, Eva could see Leland's color too pale, which she'd expected, but his eyes were sharp and present, which was what mattered. Thad cut the jacket away from the shoulder and worked quietly and efficiently and didn't narrate what he was doing. Leland looked at the cave ceiling and breathed through it. Jasper set up a rough blockade of loose stone at the entrance. Not enough to stop a determined man, but enough to slow one and make noise. He did it with the competence of someone who'd thought about this scenario before. Iva sat with her back against the cave wall and her arms around her knees and let her legs stop burning. Gideon crouched beside the fire, watching the entrance. He was still covered in ash, and the firelight made the angles of his face sharp and hard. After a while, he looked at her. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "You climbed that trail fast." "I was motivated," she said. Something that might have been amusement moved across his face for a fraction of a second and disappeared. Outside, she could still see through the gaps in Jasper's stone blockade the orange glow on the southern sky that was the barn and possibly part of the cabin. It was distant. Everything was very still. No gunshots. Hayes's men wouldn't follow them up the mountain in this dark and this cold. They'd wait for morning, which meant the night was theirs, but just the night. She was thinking about that, turning it over, when she heard it. It started as a vibration, not a sound exactly, more a pressure in the air, something moving in the mountain above them that hadn't been moving before. Then it was a sound low, building and enormous. A freight train sound that came from everywhere at once. Jasper said one word that she couldn't hear over the noise. Then the entrance went white. Snow and ice hit the cave mouth in a wave that seemed to take several seconds, but was probably much less. The stone blockade disappeared. The opening filled completely, fully, with packed snow and ice that pressed in and then stopped, held by the curve of the entrance, and then there was silence. Absolute silence. The fire was still burning. The cave was intact. They were all inside and unhurt, but the entrance was gone. Eva stood. She crossed to where the opening had been and put her hand against the packed snow. It was solid as concrete. She pressed harder and her hand didn't move. She measured with her eye, 4 feet of packed snow and ice, minimum, possibly more behind it. The weight above that would be the mass of whatever slide had released. She couldn't estimate the full extent without knowing the slope geometry. But in these temperatures, the snow would set within minutes. They were sealed in. She stood with her hand flat against the packed snow and breathed steadily and deliberately, while the reality of the situation organized itself in her mind. No entrance. Unknown oxygen supply. though the cave was large, and the pack probably had some porosity. One injured man, sub-zero temperatures outside. Hayes's men somewhere below, though Hayes's men were now the least of their problems. Behind her, Gideon's voice came through the darkness, steady, unhurried. The voice of a man who had decided some time ago that panic was a thing he didn't participate in. Hold on to me, Eva. As long as I breathe, this mountain won't swallow you. She turned around. He was right there. She hadn't heard him move. He was standing directly behind her, close enough that she could see the ash still on his jaw and the steady blue of his eyes in the firelight, and his hand came up and closed around her forearm, not pulling, not directing, just present, just there. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the packed snow wall and pressed both hands against it and began moving along its face, running her palms across the texture, reading it the way she read terrain. "All right," she said. "Let me think." Nobody slept. They sat around the fire and let the first hour pass in the particular quiet that follows catastrophe, not stunned silence, but the practical, deliberate quiet of people sorting through their situation and not wasting breath on what couldn't be changed. The avalanche had happened. The entrance was sealed. Those were facts. Everything else was a problem to be worked. Thad finished with Leland's shoulder by the firelight. He'd cleaned the wound with what he had, packed it, and stitched the deeper section with the small curved needle he kept in his kit. Leland had made almost no sound during any of it, which told Eva more about the Cross brothers' relationship with physical pain than any story could have. When Thad tied the last suture and pressed a clean pad against the shoulder and said, "That'll hold," Leland just nodded and pulled his shirt back up. "How bad is the blood loss, Eva?" asked Thad quietly. "Enough to matter," he said. "He needs rest and water and food, in that order. The wound is clean. I'm more concerned about the cold." The cold was a genuine problem. The cave was sheltered from the wind, which was something, and their small fire produced heat. But the packed snow at the entrance was already drawing warmth out of the space, the way cold always does, steadily, patiently, indifferent to preference. Eva could see their breath in the firelight. The stone walls held the temperature like a vault. She stood and moved away from the fire, pressing her back against the interior wall, and looked up. She'd been doing this since they arrived, looking at the cave's geometry, reading what the rock was telling her. The ceiling was high and irregular, granite mostly, with veins of darker rock running in diagonal bands. Those darker veins were basaltic intrusions, she thought, which meant volcanic activity in the geological history of this formation. The Teton Range was fault block, not volcanic, but the underlying geology was old enough to include periods of thermal activity. She moved deeper into the cave, past the bend in the passage, following the wall with her hand. Jasper appeared beside her with a torch he'd made from a green stick and a strip of cloth. He held it up without asking. "You're looking for something." "Maybe," she said. "What?" "Warmth," she said, "or the source of it. Feel the air back here." He stood still for a moment. Then he said, "It's different." "Yes." She moved her hand along the wall. The rock back here was warmer than it should be. Not dramatically, she wouldn't have noticed it with gloves on, but she'd had her glove off for 30 seconds, and the difference was real. And the air had something in it, a faint mineral quality, like water on hot stone. "There's a thermal fissure somewhere in this passage." The Teton fault system runs deep, and where you have deep faulting, you sometimes get geothermal veins, underground water sources heated by the Earth's interior. The rock temperature and the air quality both suggest one is close. Jasper looked at the wall, then at her. "A hot spring? Underground? Possibly." She moved further along the passage. "The passage bends again up here. If I'm reading the rock correctly, the fissure will be on the left side of the secondary passage. That's where the basaltic intrusion is densest, which is where the heat conducts most efficiently." Jasper followed her, holding the torch high. The passage narrowed, then opened again into a secondary chamber, smaller than the main cave, roughly round, with a low ceiling that sloped up toward a natural chimney in the rock. And there, in the far wall, was a fissure 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall, from which came a definite and unmistakable warmth, along with a faint curl of mineral-scented vapor. Eva put her hand directly in front of the fissure. The air coming through was warm. Not hot, the source was deeper, but warm enough to be remarkable. She looked at Jasper. "We need to make this opening larger. Can you do that?" He was already studying the rock. He ran his hand along the fissure edges, pressing, testing. "The stone here is softer than the main wall. It's been waterworked." He pressed harder at one section. "This corner will break. I'll need the heaviest thing we've got." He used the iron spike from his pack. It took him 40 minutes of sustained, deliberate work driving the spike, breaking off sections of the water-softened stone in pieces that ranged from a fist to a melon. Eva and Gideon moved the broken stone aside. The fissure grew. The warmth intensified. The mineral vapor became more pronounced, and then, as Jasper drove the spike through the last section of the lower edge, the opening became large enough to step through, and the air that came through it changed completely. Steam. Real steam, faint but present, rising from somewhere below. They went through one at a time. The chamber on the other side was small and low-ceilinged, and the floor dropped away immediately into a natural basin, maybe 12 feet across, filled with dark water that moved with the faint, slow circulation of something fed from below. The steam rose off its surface and gathered against the ceiling and drifted. The water was the color of dark glass. Eva crouched at the edge and held her hand just above the surface. The heat was substantial. She reached down and touched it. Warm, genuinely warm, mineral-rich. She could smell that sulfur and iron, but clear and moving, which meant the source was active. She stood. "It's a geothermal spring," she said, "fed by the fault system below us. The water circulates through rock that's been heated by the Earth's thermal gradient. The deeper you go in the Earth, the hotter it gets. And where there are fault lines, that heat conducts upward more efficiently. The spring will stay warm, regardless of what's happening above us. The steam will heat the chamber and the passage. We'll survive the cold." She turned around. Gideon was standing just inside the chamber, looking at the spring. And his expression was one she hadn't seen on him before. Not shock, not relief exactly. Something that lived between the two, a man confronting a problem that he'd braced himself to endure, suddenly given a way through it that he hadn't expected. He looked at her. She held his gaze and said simply, "We're going to be all right." He nodded once. Then he went back to get the others. They moved everything to the inner chamber and the secondary passage, where the warmth from the spring made an immediate and profound difference. The fire was rebuilt closer to the fissure, drawing the spring's warmth and adding to it. Leland was settled against the wall, with a blanket and 2 inches of water from the spring in a tin cup. Thad had heated it directly and pronounced it safe to drink. Mineral content and all. And the color in his face was better within an hour. Thad heated larger quantities of the spring water carefully in the tin pot from the supply pack. He used it to clean Leland's wound again, and then to soak clean cloth strips that he applied to the stitched section as a warm compress. The mineral content, he said, had natural antiseptic properties, which Eva corroborated. Certain mineral springs had been used for wound treatment since antiquity, the dissolved minerals inhibiting bacterial growth. "You're going to have an educated opinion on everything, aren't you?" Leland said, from against the wall. "Probably," Eva said. "Good," he said. "Keep talking, it helps." The firelight danced across the spring's surface and threw moving reflections up the stone walls. The steam caught the light and dispersed it, and the whole chamber had a quality that was difficult to name: warm, close, amber-lit, the sound of the water's slow movement underneath everything else. Eva sat beside the spring and let the warmth come into her from the air and the rock and the fire. And for a little while, she just breathed. Jasper had stripped his heavy outer coat and was sitting on the far side of the spring, working on something with his hands. A piece of wood from the torch carving it with his belt knife in slow, deliberate strokes. His attention was entirely on the wood, and in the firelight, the concentration on his face had a quality that was different from his usual open expression. Focused. Quiet. She'd observed him enough to know. This was how he settled himself, hands moving on wood, mind going still. Thad was checking Leland's pulse with the focused attention he brought to everything medical. His fingers on Leland's wrist, his eyes on the middle distance, counting. And Gideon sat across the fire from Eva, with his back to the wall and his long legs stretched out before him. And after a while, he stopped looking at the entrance passage and started looking at her. She felt it before she looked up. His attention had a quality she'd noticed in the first days. At the ranch, it was direct without being intrusive. The attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what they were observing and made no attempt to conceal that interest. She met his eyes. The firelight between them moved and shifted. Outside, somewhere past the sealed entrance and the mountain's mass and the frozen night, Hayes's men were presumably still alive and present. The barn was gone. Part of the cabin might be gone. February's court hearing was 6 weeks away, and a significant portion of their evidence strategy was inside Eva's coat pocket. None of that was resolvable tonight. She looked at Gideon's face, the handsome, resolute lines of it, the jaw and the steady eyes, the ash that was still in his hair from the barn fire. He looked like a man who had absorbed more than his share of hard things and had not been made smaller by any of them, she said quietly. Because the others were there but not attending to them, a person's true stature isn't found in their size or their power. He watched her. It's found in how much room their heart holds for others, she finished. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped. The spring water moved with its slow, steady sound. "Where'd you learn that?" he said. "I'm not sure I learned it," she said. "I think tonight confirmed it." He looked at the fire, then back at her. "My father used to say that a man who needs to be the biggest thing in the room is usually scared of what's in the room." He paused. "Hayes needs to own everything he looks at. He needs other people to be less. That's not power. That's fear wearing power's clothes." Eva thought about Hayes in the land office. The arranged posture, the hired men filling space behind him, the practiced intimidation. All of it designed to make other people feel small. All of it requiring constant maintenance. "That's very accurate," she said. Gideon looked at her steadily. "You weren't scared of him." "I was," she said. "I was scared and angry simultaneously, which is a useful combination. The anger keeps the fear from being the loudest thing in the room." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. They sat with the fire between them and the spring behind her and the mountain above them all, and the warmth of the geothermal water moved through the air like a slow tide. Morning came without light. No sunrise reached them. The cave had no windows. The sealed entrance let in nothing, and time became a matter of judgment and the fire's burn rate. Thad estimated 6 hours had passed, based on his internal clock, and the state of the coals, which Eva gathered, was reliable enough. He had a physician's trained relationship with the passage of time. Leland had slept 4 hours, which Thad considered acceptable. His color was better. His shoulder was stiff and painful. He said so plainly when Thad checked it, and Thad changed the dressing and told him plainly that stiff and painful was preferable to infected and septic, so he should stay still and stop arguing. Leland said he wasn't arguing. Thad said the expression on his face constituted arguing. Eva ate from the supply-packed dried meat, hard bread, a strip of preserved apple, and thought about the filed plat in her coat pocket. Then she thought about the mortgage document. Then she thought about what she'd seen in the Blackwood land office and the notations she'd made in her field book and the particular discrepancy in the datum language that had caught her attention. She pulled both documents out and spread them on the flat section of rock beside the fireland. From his position against the wall, watched her. "You're working." "I'm thinking," she said. "Working comes after thinking. What do you need?" "Your memory." she said. You said your father filed the original homestead claim in 1871. Do you know the exact date? March 14th, 1871, Leland said, without hesitating. And the land office that recorded it. Cheyenne, the Wyoming Territorial Land Office. It would have been referenced to the principal meridian established by the 1870 GLO baseline survey. Eva looked at the plat. The 1870 baseline, she said. Not the 1871 correction? The baseline was established in late 1870. The first township surveys ran through the winter. Your father's March filing would have been referenced to the original baseline before the 1871 correction survey was completed. Right, she said, which means the boundary descriptions on the filed plat use 1870 baseline language. She moved her finger along the document. Township and range references keyed to the 6th principal meridian, sections described by the original corner monuments, angles measured from magnetic north with the 1870 compass variation. Leland was watching her with complete attention. Now, the stiff shoulder forgotten. And the mortgage document uses 1875 correction language, Eva said. The correction survey was done after significant magnetic variation was detected in the original 1870 survey. The 1875 correction adjusted the township corners and updated the compass variation values. If you write a boundary description after 1875, you write it differently than if you write it before. She looked up. Whoever forged the mortgage document used a post-1875 survey map as their reference. The boundary language gives it away. The way they describe the northwest corner of the parcel, they use the corrected township corner, not the original one. Those two corners are 37 feet apart. Gideon, who had been listening from across the fire, said, "Is 37 feet significant?" In a court of law, when you're trying to claim that a mortgage describes the same parcel as a homestead title. 37 feet is enormous, Eva said. Legally, the mortgage document and the homestead title describe adjacent but distinct parcels of land. The mortgage purports to be secured against property your father owned, but the property it actually describes using the 1875 corrected corners is technically a different legal parcel than the one your father homesteaded. She stopped. Let that sit for a moment. The mortgage is void, Leland said. On its face describes property your father never owned, Eva said. A judge who understands survey law would have to throw it out. The court injunction is built on a document that doesn't legally encumber your title at all. She paused. Hayes either didn't know this, which I doubt, or he was counting on the district judge not knowing it, which is more likely. Survey datum discrepancies are technical and obscure. Most lawyers don't catch them. Most judges don't either. But a trained cartographer does, Thad said, from Leland's side. A trained cartographer catches it in about 3 minutes, Eva said. I caught it in the land office before Hayes walked through the door. The chamber was quiet. The spring moved behind her. The fire popped. Jasper said, "From across the water, that's it then. We've got him." "We've got the argument," Eva said. "We still need to make it in front of a judge who'll listen, and we need to get out of this mountain. First," she began carefully rolling the documents. "But yes, the foundation of Hayes's claim is legally hollow. I can demonstrate it cartographically with the filed plat, the mortgage document, and 15 minutes of testimony." Leland let out a slow breath. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "Eva." She looked at him. "My brothers and I advertised for a partner," he said. "I want you to know, and I'm saying this, as the brother who writes the contracts, so I choose my words deliberately. We got something we didn't have the sense to ask for specifically, and that's our considerable good fortune." She didn't have an immediate answer for that. She looked down at the rolled documents in her hands. "I'm going to need a certified copy of that plat," she said, "and a statement from the Territorial Surveyor's office, confirming the 1,870 baseline parameters." "I'll write to the Territorial office this week," Leland said. "Good." She tucked the documents back into her coat. "Now rest. Thad told you to. I've been resting for 6 hours." "Rest more," he muttered something. She chose not to hear it. The next several hours settled into a rhythm that felt, under the circumstances, almost domestic. Thad tended the fire and Leland's wound and the water supply. Jasper produced more carvings than one man should have been capable of in the available time. He had a facility with wood that was nearly automatic, his hands moving while the rest of him did other things. Gideon maintained their security, checking the entrance passage regularly, listening for sounds above the stone, and occasionally reporting that everything was still sealed, and Hayes's men were presumably still below the tree line. Eva organized her field book. She'd been making notes since the land office, but they were crisis notes, quick, compressed, written on the move. Now she laid them out properly. The datum discrepancy, with supporting measurements and document references. The timeline showing when the 1,870 baseline was established, when the homestead was filed, when the 1,875 correction occurred. A diagram of the two corner positions, and the 37-foot discrepancy, drawn precisely to scale in the field book's margin. The sequence of the Homestead Act's mineral and spring rights provisions, which Leland had recited from memory an hour ago. His recall of legal text was extraordinary, verbatim in places. She wrote it all down, clean, precise, referenced. When she looked up from the field book, she found Gideon sitting across from her again, watching. "You enjoy it," he said. "The work?" "The precision of it," he said. "I can see it when you're doing it. Your whole face changes." She considered that. "I grew up watching my uncle take credit for work I did. The precision mattered to me because it was the one thing he couldn't fake. He could sign his name on my plat sheets. He couldn't replicate what I actually understood. The geometry, the datum relationships, the physical reality of how land lies against the survey." She turned a page in the field book. "Precision is the thing that belongs to the person who actually did the thinking. Nobody can steal that." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "My father was the same way about this land," he said. "He didn't want it because it was valuable. He wanted it because he'd walked every inch of it and understood it. He knew where the spring ran in April, where the elk came down in October, where the soil changed from granite gravel to the clay basin that holds water through the dry months." He paused. "Hayes looks at land and sees what it produces. My father looked at land and saw what it was. That's a fundamental difference in how a person relates to the world," Eva said. "Yes," Gideon said. "Hayes can't understand it, which is partly why he can't understand why we won't sell." She looked at him. "Why won't you?" "I'm not asking critically. I'm asking because I want to understand it fully." He thought about this, actually thought. She could see him turning it over. "Because selling would mean he was right," Gideon said finally. "That everything is for sale. That land is just a commodity, and the person with the most money wins. And if that's true, then nothing my father built here has any permanent meaning. It's just temporary custody." He looked at the spring. "I don't believe that. I think what you build with your own hands, on your own terms, with people you love, that accumulates. It becomes something that outlasts you." Eva was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I came out here to forge a new life on my own terms. I thought that meant alone, mostly, independent." She paused, looking at the spring water. "I'm revising that." He looked at her. There was something in his eyes that she'd been aware of for a while now, a quality of attention that was different from watchfulness. Warmer, more settled. "Revising how?" he said. "Independence isn't isolation," she said. "I think I'd confused the two. My uncle treated me as property, so I assumed that connection itself was the problem, that any arrangement where other people depended on me or I depended on them was a trap." She looked at her hands. But what the five of us did in that barn, and what we've done in this cave, that's not a trap. That's what it looks like when people choose to depend on each other freely. She hadn't said anything like that out loud before. It was more than she'd intended to say, and she knew it. But it was also simply true, and she didn't take it back. Jasper looked up from his carving. "You figured that out in a week?" "2.5 weeks," she said. "I'm 26 and I'm still figuring it out," he said with complete sincerity. Thad, without looking up from the fire, said, "You're also still figuring out how a stove works, Jasper." "That's a separate issue," Jasper said. Leland laughed. It was quiet, careful, the laugh of a man with a stitched shoulder, but it was real. And in the amber light of the geothermal cave, with the spring moving, and the fire burning and the mountains sealed over them like a held breath, something in the room had shifted. Eva felt it clearly. The fear of the night before was still present. She didn't pretend it wasn't, but it had moved to the background, and what was in the foreground now was this. These four men. This fire, the field book in her lap with the argument that was going to save their home. Written out in clean, referenced notation. She was going to fight for this place. She'd decided it somewhere in the last 12 hours, and now it was simply decided the way a surveyor drives a stake into the ground and marks a boundary. This was her home, too. These people were her people. The land dispute was hers to solve as much as any of theirs. She opened her field book to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Then she began drafting the outline of her court testimony. They got out on the second day. Jasper found the weakness in the snowpack. Mid-morning, a section near the top of the sealed entrance, where the avalanche debris had bridged rather than fully compacted, leaving an air gap between the outer crust and the cave wall. He drove the iron spike into it, and the whole upper section broke outward in a cascade of loose snow that tumbled down the slope and left an opening 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, framing a rectangle of pale gray winter sky. The air that came through was brutal and clean, and the most welcome thing Eva had breathed in 36 hours. They dug the rest out by hand, working in shifts, piling the snow to either side of the entrance until the opening was full height again. Gideon went first, checking the slope, checking the tree line below. He came back in and said, Hayes's men were gone tracks in the snow leading back toward the Blackwood Road, at least 12 hours old by his estimate. Either they'd concluded the Cross family hadn't survived, or they'd retreated to report to Hayes and wait for a better opportunity. Either way, the mountain was theirs for the moment. They came down slowly, Leland's pace setting the group's pace, nobody commenting on this because it didn't require comment. The barn was a ruin of charred timber and snow-collapsed ash. The cabin's west wall had burned through in one section, but the structure itself stood, the stone fireplace intact, the interior cold but survivable. The livestock were in the corral, alive, which was the thing that mattered most to Jasper, who went to check on them before he'd fully processed the state of the cabin. The next 3 days were repair and recovery, in that order. Gideon and Jasper worked on the cabin wall with timber from the woodshed. Thad managed Leland's wound with the careful discipline of a man who knew exactly how close infection lived to an untreated graze in winter conditions. Eva rebuilt the fire, inventoried the provisions, and spent her evenings at the table with her field book, tightening the structure of the court testimony she'd drafted in the cave. On the 4th day, Leland's color was fully back. He sat across from her at the table and read through her testimony outline and didn't speak for 15 minutes, which she'd learned was his version of being impressed. "This will work," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "That's not arrogance." "No," she said, "it's geometry. The argument is either sound or it isn't. This one is." He nodded slowly. "We have 5 weeks before the February hearing. I need to write to the Territorial Surveyor's office and to a federal land law advocate in Cheyenne. There's a man named Aldrich who specializes in Homestead Act disputes. He'll know the judge." He paused. "And I need to document Hayes's coal runoff damage to the local water supply." Thad has been collecting samples for months. At it, Eva said. Every layer of evidence makes the argument harder to dismiss. Hayes will have his own lawyers. We need the case to be undeniable. Leland looked at her for a moment. You said you came here to build something that was yours, he said. Yes. Is this it? She looked down at the field book, at the careful notations, the diagrams, the referenced evidence that had taken shape over the last 3 weeks under the pressure of cold and urgency and genuine necessity. Part of it, she said. The evening of the 4th day was quiet, in a way the ranch hadn't been since her arrival. The repairs were holding, the livestock were fed. Leland was resting under Thad's orders and complying under protest. Jasper had taken the horses out to the south pasture for exercise and come back in a better mood than he'd been in all week. Gideon built the fire up in the main room and said, "Come see something." Eva followed him through the east door. She hadn't been through before a passage she'd assumed, led to storage and found instead that it connected to a lower section of the rock formation behind the cabin, a natural shelf of granite that led, after 20 feet of passage, to the upper edge of the cave system they'd survived in. The geothermal spring was accessible from below, through this back route, without the exposed mountain climb. The inner chamber looked different, with light and intention and without fear. The spring moved in its basin, dark and mineral warm, the steam curling against the stone ceiling. Someone, Gideon, she guessed, from the character of the work, had cleared the floor of debris and laid flat stones around the spring's edge as a border. The others came in behind them. Thad with a lamp, Jasper with the supply of dry wood they'd left on the first night. Leland moving carefully, but moving. They rebuilt the fire on the flat stones at the spring's edge, and the chamber filled with amber light and the familiar warmth of the water. And the steam moved through the firelight in slow, visible currents. Eva stood at the spring's edge and looked at the water. She thought about Baltimore, the narrow house on Federal Street, the drafting table she'd worked at by candlelight after her uncle went to bed, the careful pretense of smallness she'd maintained for years as a form of survival strategy, agreeing without agreeing, complying without surrendering, keeping the core of herself, the precision, the intelligence, the absolute certainty that she knew what she knew, locked behind a performed version of herself that Chester Sterling found appropriately modest. She didn't need that performance here. These men had seen her direct a structural repair in a blizzard. They'd followed her into a rock fissure on her geological instinct. They'd listened while she explained date-dumb discrepancies by firelight with a wounded man against the wall and an avalanche over the door. They'd heard her say true things about herself and said true things in return, without negotiation, without any of it being used against her. Later, she stepped out of her boots. The stone was warm beneath her feet from the spring's heat. She looked at the 4 of them. "I want to go in," she said. Nobody moved to stop her or to comment. Gideon simply met her eyes and held them, and his expression was the same one she'd learned over the past weeks. Open, present, waiting on her lead. She stepped into the water. The warmth came up around her slowly as she descended the natural slope of the basin floor. The mineral water was silky in a way that plain water wasn't, the dissolved content giving it a faint weight and softness. The spring was deep at the center, shallow at the edges, and she stopped when the water reached her waist and turned to face the fire. One by one, the others came in. No hurry, no performance. Gideon entered the water with the same deliberate economy. He brought to everything physical, each movement intentional, nothing wasted. Thad was quiet and careful. Jasper was simply himself, unguarded as always. The tension of the past days finally releasing from his shoulders the moment the warmth came up around him. And Leland, moving slowly with the stitched shoulder, stepped in last and let out a long, slow breath as the warm mineral water reached the wound site and the heat worked into the damaged tissue. The fire on the flat stones threw amber light across the water's surface and up the walls and across the faces of 4 enormous, scarred, Gentlemen who had, over the course of 3 weeks and one very serious winter, become the most real thing in Eva Sterling's world. The water cradled her. The warmth was thorough, not just surface warmth, but deep warmth, the kind that comes from geothermal mineral water that has been heated by the earth itself, traveling through miles of hot rock before reaching the surface. It moved through muscle and bone and the accumulated cold and fear and labor of the past days and dissolved all of it, degree by degree. 4 pairs of hands came to her in the water, not claiming, not directing, gentle. Each touch a question answered only by her own movement toward it, her own decision made freely in the amber-lit warmth of a spring that the mountain had kept hidden until she found it. She looked up at the sheer presence surrounding her. The size of these men, which she'd registered on the first day and then stopped registering because size had been replaced by character. But here, now, in the water, with the firelight on their faces and their hands warm against her skin, she felt it again. Not as intimidation, as something entirely different. As safety with no performance required, as strength that had never once been turned against her. The warm mineral water cradled her frame, as 4 pairs of strong hands caressed her with overwhelming devotion and profound care. Eva let the last of her held tension go. She looked up at the sculpted breadth of 4 mountain men and felt the magnitude of what surrounded her, not just the physical reality of them, but the full weight of what they'd built together in 3 weeks of storms and fights and geothermal caves and honest conversations by firelight. It rose up in her, all at once, past the careful management she normally maintained, past the precision and the field notes and the testimony outlines. So much bigger than me, Eva exclaimed, breathless, looking up at them in the water and the light, not just their size. Not just the physical reality of 4 enormous men surrounding one woman in a warm underground spring. The love was bigger. The protection was bigger. The life being built here was bigger than anything she'd been able to imagine when she'd read that advertisement on a bench in a Baltimore train station 3 months ago. And then there was no more space for words. What happened in the warm water and amber firelight of the geothermal spring was unhurried and complete the final dissolution of every wall Eva Sterling had built to survive a world that had consistently treated her as a thing to be managed. In their place came something she hadn't had language for until now, being known, being chosen, being held by people who had seen the full truth of her and moved toward it rather than away. The mountain held them. The spring held them. The fire burned on. February arrived with a thaw. It was subtle at first, a degree or 2 of warmth in the afternoon sun that hadn't been there the week before. The snow pulling back from the south-facing rock faces, the creek below the cabin running again under its ice crust with an audible sound that returned like an old friend. The Tetons were still white from base to summit, but the light on them had changed. The hard blue shadow of deep winter was softening. Eva noticed it from the porch on a Tuesday morning and decided it was a good omen, which was not the sort of thing she normally permitted herself. She permitted it this time. The 6 weeks between the cave and the February hearing had been full. Leland's shoulder healed cleanly, which Thad announced with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose work had gone exactly as intended. The Territorial Surveyor's Office sent a certified statement confirming the 1,870 baseline parameters signed by the Chief Surveyor and bearing the Territorial Seal. The federal land advocate in Cheyenne Aldrich, sharp and direct in his correspondence, confirmed that the datum discrepancy argument was legally sound, and that the presiding judge for the Blackwood Circuit, a man named Harkness, had a reputation for technical exactitude. He would understand the survey argument. He would care about it. Thad's water samples went to Aldrich, along with a written analysis documenting elevated coal particulate and chemical runoff consistent with the Hayes mine's drainage patterns. 3 families, downstream of the mine families, who'd lost livestock to tainted water and hadn't known why agreed to be named as additional complainants. The case, as Eva looked at it the week before the hearing, was a wall, not a single argument. A wall of them: the fraudulent datum, the void mortgage, the mineral and spring rights protections under the Homestead Act, the documented environmental damage, the federal land violations. Hayes had money and local influence. He did not have the truth, and in a federal circuit court, with a judge who valued precision, that was a significant problem for him. She told Gideon this the night before they rode to Blackwood. "What's the risk?" he said. "Tell me straight." "Hayes could have influenced the judge already," she said. "Money corrupts processes that are supposed to be sound. I believe this judge is honest, based on everything Aldrich told us. But I can't guarantee it." Gideon nodded. "And if he is honest, then Hayes loses his claim today and loses his freedom shortly after," she said. "Federal land fraud and documented poisoning of a water supply are federal offenses. The marshal will have basis to act." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. They rode to Blackwood at dawn. 5 horses, 5 riders. Eva had her maps in the leather tube across her back. Leland had his legal documents in the satchel at his hip. Thad carried the water sample analysis, sealed and signed. Jasper rode, at the outside of the group, alert and quiet in the particular way he got when he was reading the terrain around him for threat. The town was already awake when they came through the tree line. Word had apparently traveled. People were on the boardwalks, watching the road. Some of the faces she recognized from her first arrival. Some she didn't. A woman near the general store caught Eva's eye and held it with an expression that was too complicated to be just hope, but had hope somewhere in it. The courthouse was the most substantial building in Blackwood, after the Hayes Coal Office Stone Foundation. 2-story timber frame, an American flag on the roof staff that snapped in the morning wind. Eva tied her horse at the rail and looked at the building for a moment. Then she went in. Judge Harkness was a compact man in his 60s, with white hair and the watchful eyes of someone who had spent decades distinguishing between argument and evidence. He called the court to order at 9 o'clock and looked at both tables, the cross-party on the left, Hayes and his 2 lawyers on the right, with equal impassivity. Hayes had arrived first. He sat at his table with the settled authority of a man on his own ground, flanked by the lawyers, and he looked at Eva when she came in with the same assessing coldness he'd used in the land office. She returned it with the same direct attention she'd used then, and sat down and opened her map tube. The proceedings began. Hayes's lead lawyer presented the mortgage document first. He was smooth, experienced, built for courtroom performance. He spoke in a measured cadence that was designed to sound like reason, even when it wasn't. The mortgage was legitimate, he argued. The debt was real. The title encumbrance was valid. The Cross family owed a substantial sum and had refused to settle. The court should enforce the mortgage, transfer the title, and close the matter. Leland responded. He was not a performer. He was precise and unhurried and dismantled the mortgage's legitimacy in sequential order. Each point referenced to a specific document on the table. Each document authenticated. When he reached the datum discrepancy, he looked at Eva. She stood. She spread the filed plat on the table facing Judge Harkness and placed the mortgage document beside it. Then she put her field book beside both, open to the diagram she'd drawn by firelight in the geothermal cave, the one showing the 2 corner positions and the 37-foot discrepancy to scale. "Your Honor," she said, "I am a trained cartographer and land surveyor. I am going to explain a technical discrepancy in these 2 documents that is not large in physical terms, but is legally decisive." Harkness looked at the diagram. "Proceed." She walked him through it. The 1,870 baseline, the 1,875 correction, the difference in datum language, the specific corner reference that revealed the mortgage, had been drafted from a post-1,875 survey map. She spoke in plain language. matching her pace to Harkness's attention, stopping when he looked at the documents and resuming when he looked back at her. When she finished, the courtroom was quiet. Harkness looked at the two documents side by side for a long moment. Then he said, "The northwest corner reference in the mortgage document. You're saying that corner did not exist in the survey record at the time this mortgage was allegedly executed." "Correct," Eva said. "That corner monument was established by the 1875 correction survey. The mortgage is dated 1874. Whoever wrote this document used a map that didn't exist yet." Harkness looked at Hayes's table. "Counselor." Response. Hayes's lawyer stood. He spoke for 4 minutes. He used words like clerical and minor variants and immaterial to the substance of the instrument. He did not once address the specific fact that the corner monument hadn't existed in 1874. Harkness let him finish. Then he looked at Hayes directly, which he hadn't done before, and Hayes seemed to register the difference. Thad presented the water sample analysis. He was calm and exact, explaining the chemical composition of the downstream water, the coal particulate levels, the correlation with the Hayes mine's drainage outflow. He named the 3 families affected. He named the livestock they'd lost. He cited the federal statute protecting navigable waterways and their tributaries from industrial contamination. The courtroom had filled while he spoke. People from the boardwalks outside, Eva realized they'd come in. The woman from the general store was near the back wall. Miners, she thought, looking at the men beside her. Men who worked for Hayes and had apparently decided today to do something different. Harkness called a 30-minute recess. Hayes crossed the room during the recess. He stopped in front of Eva, not in front of Leland or Gideon. In front of Eva. "You're a long way from Baltimore," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "This isn't over," he said. "Mathematically," she said. "It is." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he went back to his table. Harkness returned. He sat. He looked at his notes. Then he looked up. "The mortgage instrument presented by the plaintiff is void," he said. "The boundary descriptions within it do not correspond to the parcel held under the Cross homestead title. The document is fraudulent on its face, and the court injunction issued against the Cross title is hereby dissolved. Furthermore, the evidence presented regarding water contamination constitutes federal environmental violations under the Waterways Protection Act. I am referring this matter to the federal marshal for immediate investigation." He looked at Hayes. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "you will remain available." The federal marshal, who had been standing at the back of the courtroom, Eva hadn't noticed him. She'd been looking at the judge, moved forward through the crowd. The crowd itself moved. Not violently. Just forward. The miners, the women from the boardwalk, the families from downstream, they came forward and filled the space between Hayes's table and the door. And Hayes looked at them and seemed to finally understand that his local authority had ended sometime in the past hour, and nobody had told him until now. Eva stood at the table with her hands on the filed plat and watched the marshal put his hand on Hayes's arm and felt something release in her chest that had been held tight since the moment she'd read that fraudulent mortgage document in Leland's ledger weeks ago. Outside, the February sun was stronger than it had been in months. Spring came to the Teton Valley like a decision that had finally been made. It wasn't gradual, or it didn't feel that way. One week the ground was frozen, and the creek was still under its ice. And then there was a warm front from the south that lasted 4 days without a break. And when it was done, the valley was changed. The snow retreated up the mountain slopes. The creek ran full and fast and clear. The meadow south of the barn, Gideon and Jasper, had rebuilt through February in the spare hours around. Everything else came up green in patches, then wider, then all at once in an unbroken sweep of new grass that reached to the tree line. The wild paintbrush came first, then the lupine in long drifts of purple and blue along the north fence line, where the soil was deep and the meltwater ran slow. Eva had never seen lupine in bloom before. She stood at the fence one morning in March and looked at it for a long time. Jasper came to stand beside her. He looked at the flowers, then at her. Still, think maps capture it, he said. No, she said. Maps tell you where things are. They don't tell you what they look like when the lupine comes in. She paused. I've been revising my understanding of what maps are for. What are they for? Getting you to the place, she said. The place does the rest. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I made you something, and held out a small carved figure, a woman, maybe 4 inches tall, with a map tube in one hand and her chin up. The detail in the wood was extraordinary. He'd carved the binding on the map tube, the buttons on the coat, the particular angle of her jaw that she recognized from her own reflection. She took it and turned it in her fingers. Jasper, she said, you don't have to say anything, he said. I know, she said. Thank you. He nodded and went back to the barn. She kept the figure in her coat pocket from that day on. The Western Surveying and Healing Academy was Leland's name, and it was Eva's idea, and the reality of it was something they'd all built together through the whole of March and April. It started with a conversation, Eva and Leland, at the table. One evening, after the Hayes verdict had been formalized and the title cleared, and the federal charges against Bartholomew Hayes filed with the territorial court in Cheyenne, where Hayes was now significantly occupied with his own legal situation. The land is secure, Leland had said. Yes, Eva had said. And we have the spring rights, he said. The geothermal spring is on our mineral title, which means the water access belongs to us. That's a resource. It's warm and clean and consistent, Eva said. Fed could use it for treatment. The mineral content has genuine therapeutic properties. And the survey knowledge, Leland said, land ownership is being contested across this entire territory. Women who inherit property from husbands, women who file their own homestead claims, women moving west, who need to understand what they're entitled to and how to document it. He paused. A place that taught practical surveying and land law alongside the medical care Thad can provide, and vocational skills. It would need structure, Eva said. You're a cartographer, he said. You understand structure. She drafted the first outline that same night. The academy opened in April. Officially, though informally, it had been operating. Since the first woman arrived in late March, a widow named Clara Bowman from Lander, 40 years old, who'd inherited her husband's homestead claim and had been told by a county official that women couldn't hold title, which was a lie, and who'd heard through the network of information that travels between isolated women in frontier territories that there were people at the Cross Ranch who could help. Eva spent 3 days with Clara Bowman working through the Homestead Act provisions, explaining the title documentation process, drafting the boundary description for the claim in proper current survey language, and writing a letter to the county recorder's office that was precise enough and well-referenced enough to make the official's incorrect position legally untenable. Clara Bowman filed her claim and held her title. She came back the following week with 2 other women. By May, there were 11 people at the ranch who hadn't been there in February. 6 women working through land claim issues. 2 orphan boys Thad had found in Blackwood during the Hayes investigation. A young woman from the mining settlement who was learning practical medicine from Thad, and a Shoshone woman named Pale Feather, who arrived one morning on horseback and said she'd heard there was a cartographer here who understood treaty boundary law, which Eva did not quite, but was willing to learn alongside her. The barn loft became sleeping space. Jasper built 2 additional cabin rooms in March and was starting a 3rd. Leland conducted land law sessions at the main table. 3 afternoons a week. Eva's survey workshops moved to the meadow in good weather, where she could teach practical measurement against real terrain, and students worked in pairs, because that was how fieldwork was done. Thad built a small treatment room off the east side of the cabin with access to the spring through the rock passage and the warm mineral water that had saved their lives in January now moved through a practical treatment program that addressed everything from frostbite recovery to the physical consequences of sustained hard labor. The ranch had become something that had no single name in 1,883, though Academy was what they called it, and what the people who came there called it when they went back to wherever they'd come from and told others. Eva was on the porch on a morning in late May when Gideon came out and stood beside her with 2 cups of coffee. She took hers and looked out at the valley. The mountains were still white at the summit, but green. 3/4 of the way up now, the trees thick and dark against the sky. The meadow was full color. The creek was a constant sound from here, running fast with snowmelt. 3 of the Academy's students were working in the south field, and she could hear Leland's voice from inside the cabin, conducting a session, steady and precise. She was showing at the waist now visibly. Had been for 4 weeks. She'd told each of the 4 brothers privately, not as an announcement, but as a conversation, and each response had been different and entirely characteristic. Gideon had been very still for a long moment, and then said quietly, "Good." Leland had asked 3 practical questions about timing and resource requirements, and then gone quiet in the way that meant he was moved past his ability to process it analytically. Thad had already guessed, and received the confirmation with the particular warmth of a man who loved children and medicine equally. Jasper had picked her up off the ground, remembered immediately that she was pregnant, set her down, and apologized, and then picked her up again more carefully. She loved all 4 of those responses equally. Gideon stood beside her now with his coffee, and they looked at the valley together. After a while, he said, "You're thinking." "Always," she said. "About what?" she considered. "About how different this is from what I expected when I got on that train in November. What I was hoping for was safety. Something stable, a place where I wasn't property." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I got all of that, and then about 9 other things I didn't know to ask for." He was quiet for a moment. "Like what?" "Work that matters," she said. "Clara Bowman holds her land because of something I did. Pale Feather and I are building a treaty boundary archive that didn't exist before and will protect claims that would otherwise be dismissed." She paused. "People I chose and who chose me. A child coming into a home that was built on purpose, out of free decisions made by free people." She looked at the mountains. "I came here thinking freedom was about getting away from things. I understand now that it's actually about what you move toward." Gideon looked at her. The morning light was full on his face, and she could see everything in it, the steadiness that had been there from the first day on the porch, and underneath that, something warmer that had grown slowly, and was no longer new. "Your father was right," she said. "What you build with your own hands, on your own terms, with people you love, it accumulates." He was quiet for a long moment. The valley stretched out before them, green and wide and entirely itself. Then he said, "He'd have liked you." "Good," she said. "I'd have liked him." Inside, Leland's voice continued the session. Jasper's mallet sounded from the new cabin room's construction. Thad crossed the yard below the porch with the medical kit, heading toward the treatment room, and looked up and raised a hand, and Eva raised hers back. She looked out at the vast Wyoming sky, the enormous, indifferent, magnificent sky that didn't care about social conventions or fraudulent mortgages or what a woman was supposed to want or be. Love and dignity and human freedom, she thought, were never meant to be confined by narrow social conventions. When we dare to open our hearts and fight for what is right, the world becomes so much bigger and brighter than we ever imagined. She didn't say it aloud. She didn't need to. It was simply true. The way the mountains were true. The way the lupine along the fence line was true. The way the small carved figure in her coat pocket was true. The morning moved around her, full of work and life, and the particular brightness of a Wyoming spring that has come through a hard winter. And means it. Eva Sterling, cartographer, surveyor, partner, mother-to-be, and something for which 1,883 had not yet developed adequate vocabulary. drank her coffee and watched the valley, and was, completely and without qualification, home. Eva Sterling got on a train in November with one bag, a worn leather map tube, and the absolute certainty that she was done being someone else's asset. She didn't know where she was going. Not really. She knew the geography, the fault lines, the elevation, the soil composition of the Teton Range. She'd studied the maps. But she didn't know what was waiting for her at the end of that ride, and she went anyway. That decision, that single act of choosing her own direction over someone else's plan for her life, is where this story really begins. And it's where I want to leave you tonight. Because here's what Eva figured out, slowly, the hard way, in blizzards and gunfights, and a sealed cave with a geothermal spring, and four men who never once tried to make her smaller freedom, isn't the absence of difficulty. It's not the absence of danger, or cold, or uncertainty, or days when everything you built is on fire, and a man with money and hired guns is standing between you and what's yours. Freedom is the ability to face all of that and still be the one making the decisions. Still be the one holding the map. Still be the one who says, all right, let me think. That's what she had, that Chester Sterling never understood and Bartholomew Hayes never could buy. Not the cadastral drafts, not the survey knowledge, not even the legal argument that broke his fraudulent mortgage in open court. What she had was the unshakable conviction that her mind belonged to her. Her hands belonged to her. Her future belonged to her. And once a person truly believes that really believes it, in their bones, the way Eva believed it on that frozen train, rolling west through the Nebraska, dark, it becomes very difficult for anyone to take it away. The Cross brothers understood something that most people in 1882 didn't have language for yet. They understood that strength without respect is just force. That a household built on fear might look like power from the outside, but it hollows out from the center. And eventually it collapses the same way a carrying beam fails when the support beneath it is wrong. Gideon understood it. Leland understood it well enough to write an advertisement that said, "We do not seek a housemaid. We seek an equal and mean every word." Thad and Jasper understood it in the way that people understand things that are simply part of who they are. And because they understood it, they built something real. Something that held weight. Something that outlasted the winter, and the arsonists, and the fraudulent court injunction, and everything else Hayes threw at it. The academy that grew out of that ranch in the spring of 1883, the women who came and learned to hold their own land titles, the children who found shelter there, Pale Feather, and the Treaty Boundary Archive, Clara Bowman standing in front of a county recorder's office with documentation that could not be dismissed. None of that was an accident. It was the direct result of 5 people who chose, freely and repeatedly, to build towards something rather than just away from something. There's a difference. Eva named it herself, standing on that porch in late May with coffee and a child on the way, and the Wyoming spring laid out in front of her. I came here thinking freedom was about getting away from things. I understand now that it's actually about what you move toward. I think about that line a lot, because most of us spend more energy running from what we don't want than moving toward what we do. And the stories we tell, the ones that stay with us, the ones we come back to, are almost always about someone who stopped running and started building. Eva Sterling stopped running somewhere between the Nebraska plains and the Teton Range, in the dark on a train going 60 miles an hour, when she tightened her grip on that map tube and decided her hands were going to build her own future. Everything after that was just the work of making it true. That's the story. That's what it's really about. Underneath the blizzards and the land law and the geothermal spring and 4 mountain men who were exactly as large as you imagined them. It's about a woman who knew her own worth before anyone else in the room did, and refused to settle for less. And it's about what becomes possible when the people around you rise to meet that. Thank you for spending this time with Eva and the Cross family. If this story meant something to you, if it gave you something to think about, something to feel, something to carry with you, share it with someone who needs it tonight.